November 1883. The Wind River Range, Wyoming Territory. The most respected builder in the territory stood outside a half-finished cabin and called it a death trap. "That man's going to kill his family," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. By spring, 17 families had copied the design he condemned. Today, you're going to understand why the worst idea in frontier construction became the most copied solution in the territory, and why the numbers made every critic go silent. If you want to receive one real historical survival technique every week, techniques that work when life actually depended on it, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what you're about to see changed how an entire region survived winter. Let's find out what this builder understood that the experts completely missed. Samuel Garrett wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. He was trying to keep his children from shivering through another February. The problem everyone faced wasn't just cold. It was wood. In the Wind River Valley, a standard cabin burned through 12 to 15 cords of pine per winter. Families spent entire summers cutting, hauling, splitting. And still by March, people were burning fence posts and furniture. The valley's building method followed a pattern brought from Vermont and Pennsylvania. Single-wall log construction. Stone fireplace on the gable end. Chimney built straight up the exterior wall. Simple. Proven. Exhausting. Samuel's neighbor, a carpenter named Dutch Hendricks, went through 14 cords a previous winter and still had ice forming on the inside of his door every morning. His wife stuffed rags into gaps between logs. His children slept in coats. When the January winds came down from the mountains, the heat simply vanished, pulled straight up the chimney or leaked through 100 invisible cracks. But Samuel had noticed something during his second winter in the territory. On the coldest mornings, the warmest place on his property wasn't inside his cabin. It was inside his woodshed, a rough structure he'd built to keep his fuel supply dry. The shed had double walls with an air gap, snow piled against the outer wall. And somehow, even without a fire, the interior stayed above freezing. He started thinking about that gap, about that snow, about the way the shed trapped air between two layers of wood. What if he built the cabin inside the shed? Not a shed around a cabin. A cabin with two complete walls, one structural, one protective, with a full airspace between them. The inner cabin would be tight, chinked, solid. The outer shell would be rough-sawn pine, deliberately loose-fitted to allow moisture to escape, but snow to pile up. Between them, 18 inches of dead air space that would act like a blanket. The woodshed would become the house, and the house would live inside its own fuel supply. It sounded insane. It looked like giving up. It required nearly double the lumber of a standard build. Samuel started cutting trees in May. By July, the framing was up, and people were stopping on the trail to stare. 2 complete log structures, one nested inside the other, with a walking space between them. The inner cabin was 12 feet by 16 feet, tight, squared, chinked with clay and moss. The outer shell was 16 feet by 20 feet, rough and open, with gaps between the boards wide enough to slide a hand through. Samuel built the inner cabin first. Traditional dovetail corners, 6-inch lodgepole pine, a small stone fireplace set into the north wall with the chimney running up through the center of the structure instead of outside. He insulated the floor with 8 inches of sand and gravel, then laid split pine planks over it. The roof was double-layered. Split shakes on the inside, sod and bark on the outside, with 6 inches of loose straw packed between. Then he built the second structure around it. The outer walls were rough-cut lumber, spaced a 1/4 inch apart, designed to breathe. He left the south side open for door access and with storage. The gap between inner and outer walls became a continuous corridor, accessible, inspectable, and most importantly, filled with air that wouldn't move. People asked why he was wasting lumber. He said he was saving it. The design did something no one in the valley had tried. It separated the functions of structure and insulation. The inner cabin held heat. The outer shell blocked wind and held snow. The air gap between them couldn't conduct, couldn't convect, couldn't move. Heat loss required movement. Samuel was eliminating movement, but the design had problems that made experienced builders shake their heads. The double wall created a moisture trap. Warm air from inside would condense in the gap, rot the inner logs, and collapse the structure within 5 years. That's what Anders Peterman said, and he'd built 40 cabins across Montana and Wyoming. The loose outer boards would let rain through, soaking the inner cabin. The snow load would crush the outer frame. The chimney, running through the center instead of up an outside wall, would fill the cabin with smoke because it wouldn't draw properly without exterior heat. And if a fire ever started, the double wall would turn the whole structure into a furnace with no way to fight it. Samuel addressed every objection with quiet specificity. Moisture would escape to the deliberately spaced outer boards, like a breathing skin. The inner cabin's clay chinking would prevent interior humidity from reaching the gap. The chimney would draw better, not worse, because it stayed warm along its entire length instead of freezing on an exterior wall. The outer frame was overbuilt with 8-inch posts on 2-foot centers. It could hold 3 feet of snow, and the walking gap between walls would let him inspect for fire, rot, or rodents every week of the year. He wasn't guessing. He'd spent 2 winters thinking it through. But thinking didn't matter to the men who built cabins for a living. Anders Peterman made his opinion known in August at the trading post, with a dozen men listening. That double wall's going to rot out before his first kid learns to walk, he said. I've seen what moisture does to trap logs. You get black mold, you get powder rot, you get structure failure. And when it fails, it won't just lean, it'll collapse inward. That whole mess will come down on his family while they're sleeping. Someone asked if the air gap might work the way Samuel claimed. Air gap's fine if you're building an ice house, Anders said. But you can't live in a design that fights itself. Warm air is going to condensate on those cold inner logs every single night. You'll have water running down the inside of his walls by December. I've been building since '64. I know what works. That doesn't. Another builder, a man named Cyrus Albright, was more direct. It's not a cabin. It's a lumber crib with a stove inside. A real structure holds itself. 1 wall, 1 roof, 1 frame. That thing's got 2 of everything and does none of it right. Samuel's a good man, but he doesn't know building. The criticism spread fast. By September, when Samuel and his wife Mary moved their 3 children into the finished cabin, people weren't just skeptical. They were concerned. A woman from the church asked Mary if she felt safe. Safe from what? Mary asked. From the house, the woman said. The local timber supplier, who'd sold Samuel nearly double the usual wood for a cabin, told people he'd try to talk him out of it. I sold him the logs because he insisted, but I told him he was making a mistake. That design's going to cost him more in repairs than he saved in heating, if it stands long enough to need repairs. Even men who respected Samuel's work ethic called the cabin the experiment, and not in a kind way. The social judgment was worse than the technical criticism. Building a cabin wasn't just construction. It was a statement about your ability to provide, to protect, to endure. A man who built a strange cabin was a man who didn't trust the proven methods. And if you didn't trust the methods, you didn't trust the men who'd survive with them. One phrase followed Samuel through the fall. He's scared of winter. That's what they said when he wasn't around. That the double wall was fear built into wood. That a real man heated his home with work, not tricks. That his children would grow up soft. Samuel didn't defend himself. He split wood, stacked it in the corridor between his walls, and waited. Winter would speak for him. The cold came early in 1883. By mid-November, the temperature dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. By December, it hadn't been above 20 degrees in 3 weeks. On December 18th, a blizzard moved down from the Absaroka Range and locked the Wind River Valley under 2 feet of snow and 5 straight days of wind that made standing upright outside feel like drowning. The temperature hit 18 below zero, then 22 below. Then, on the night of December 21st, it dropped to 29 below. That was the night Dutch Hendricks ran out of dry wood. He'd been burning wet pine for 2 days, green stuff he'd cut in late September, thinking he had time to season it. But the cold came too fast, and wet wood doesn't burn, it steams. His cabin filled with smoke. His fireplace choked. His children coughed through the night, and by dawn, ice was forming on the water bucket 6 feet from the hearth. He wasn't alone. Across the valley, families burned everything they had. furniture, barrel staves, roof shakes pulled from sheds. The smoke rising from chimneys turned thin and gray, the color of desperation, and still the cold pressed down. Anders Peterman's cabin, built solid with the best methods he knew, held 51 degrees inside when the fire was roaring. When the fire died to coals overnight, the temperature dropped to 34 degrees by morning. His wife slept in 2 coats. His daughter's hands went numb while she ate breakfast. Cyrus Albright burned through a half-core of split pine in 3 days and still couldn't get his cabin above 55 degrees. He started sleeping in shifts with his son, one of them awake all night feeding the fire, because letting it die meant waking to a frozen home. People stopped visiting each other. The cold made every trip outside dangerous. You went out to get wood. You came back fast, and you didn't open the door again unless you had to. On December 23rd, the wind finally stopped. The temperature stayed at 19 below zero, but the stillness made it survivable. Men went outside to check on neighbors, to see who needed help, to see who'd made it through. That's when they walked past Samuel Garrett's cabin and stopped. Smoke rose from his chimney, thin, steady, controlled. Not the thick, desperate smoke of a fire burning everything could grab. Not the weak gray smoke of wet with choking out heat. Just a calm, efficient column of smoke that said, someone inside is comfortable. Dutch Hendricks stood outside that double-walled structure and did the math in his head. He'd burned 6 cords of wood since October. Samuel had burned, what, 2? Maybe 3? Stay with me, because the numbers that came out of that winter humiliated every man who called Samuel's cabin a mistake. Dutch Hendricks knocked on Samuel's door on Christmas morning. Not for help, for answers. Samuel opened the door in shirt sleeves. No coat, no hat. Behind him, the cabin glowed warm. His children sat at the table in normal clothes, not bundled, not shivering, just sitting. The way people sit in April, not December. Dutch felt the air roll out past him. It wasn't just warm. It was steady, the kind of warmth that soaks into your bones, instead of hitting your face and vanishing behind you. How warm is it in here? Dutch asked. Samuel checked the thermometer hanging near the door. 68 degrees. 68 degrees. On a morning when the outside air sat at 19 below zero, that was an 87-degree difference held by wood, air, and stone. Dutch had kept his cabin at 51 degrees while burning himself into exhaustion. Samuel's family was comfortable, and the fire in his hearth was barely more than coals. How much were you burning? Dutch asked. 2 logs in the morning, 2 at night, sometimes 1 midday if it's windy. Dutch was burning 8 logs every 4 hours just to keep his cabin tolerable. Samuel was using 1/6 the wood and maintaining 17 degrees more heat. The math was brutal. Over the next week, as the cold eased and people started moving to the valley again, the story spread in numbers that no one could argue with. Anders Peterman's cabin. 6 cords would burn from November to January. Interior temperature averaged 48 degrees overnight, 55 degrees during active fire. Morning temperature regularly dropped below 40 degrees. Time to reheat the cabin after the fire died, for hours of continuous burning. Cyrus Albright's cabin, similar performance. High with consumption, low heat retention, constant labor. His son developed a cough from smoke exposure that lasted until March. Samuel Garrett's cabin, 2.5 cords would burn over the same period. Interior temperature stayed between 64 and 72 degrees around the clock. Morning temperature never dropped below 60 degrees, even when the fire had been out for 8 hours. Time to reheat after a dead fire, 40 minutes. The double-wall design wasn't just better. It was a different category of structure. The outer shell blocked wind completely. Snow piled against it, adding another layer of insulation. The 18-inch air gap between walls didn't conduct heat outward because air, when trapped and still, insulates better than wood. The inner cabin's tight construction and clay chinking stopped interior air from leaking. The center-mounted chimney stayed warm along its entire length, creating a draw so efficient that Samuel's fire never smoked, even when he damped it down to coals overnight. The sand and gravel floor base stored heat during the day and released it slowly at night. The double-layered roof with straw insulation stopped heat from escaping upward. the single biggest loss point in standard cabins. And the corridor between walls, stacked with firewood, meant Samuel's fuel was always dry, always ready, always at hand. But the most shocking number came from the stone fireplace itself. Samuel had built his firebox smaller than standard, 14 inches deep instead of 24. The reduced size forced the fire to burn hotter and more completely, extracting more heat from less wood. The chimney design, running to the cabin center, radiated warmth into the room along its entire height. Where a standard exterior chimney gave most of its heat to the outside air, Samuel's chimney turned itself into a vertical radiator inside his home. He'd measured it during the coldest week. The surface temperature of his chimney stones, 3 feet above the firebox, stayed at 112 degrees Fahrenheit, even hours after the fire had dropped the coals. His cabin wasn't just efficient, it was engineered. And every man who called it a death trap now had to face a simple, undeniable fact. Samuel's family had been warmer, safer, and more comfortable than anyone else in the valley, while using 73% less wood than the proven method. The cold had delivered its verdict, and it wasn't even close. By late January, Anders Peterman walked to Samuel's cabin and asked to see the design. He didn't apologize, didn't explain himself, just said, "I need to understand what you did here." Samuel walked him through it, showed him the double walls, the air gap, the center chimney, the insulated floor, explained the principle: separation of structure and insulation, wind blocking, heat retention, moisture management through deliberate gaps in the outer shell. Anders listened without interrupting. When Samuel finished, Anders ran his hand along the inner wall and said 6 words that changed everything. He wasn't being stubborn. He was being practical. Within 2 weeks, 3 families asked Samuel for help modifying their cabins. They couldn't rebuild from scratch, but they could add outer shells, insulate roofs, relocate chimneys. Samuel spent February teaching what he'd learned, not as a teacher, but as a neighbor who'd figured something out and didn't see a reason to keep it secret. Dutch Hendricks built a full second wall around his cabin that spring. He used rougher lumber, spaced it wider, left the south side open for access. It wasn't as refined as Samuel's design, but it worked. The next winter, he burned 4 cords instead of 6 and kept his cabin 10 degrees warmer. Cyrus Albright didn't add a second wall. He built a thermal corridor. He framed a 3-foot-wide addition along his north wall, packed it with straw bales, and stored his firewood inside it. The wood stayed dry, the north wall stayed insulated, and his cabin warmed faster with less fuel. A trapper named Josiah Kern visited the valley in March and saw what people were building. He brought the idea back to his camp near Du Bois and built a modified version, using canvas and pine boughs for the outer layer. It worked well enough that 2 other trappers copied it. By the winter of 1885, 17 cabins within a 50-mile radius had incorporated some version of Samuel's design: double walls, thermal corridors, insulated roofs, center chimneys, split functions. It wasn't that Samuel invented something new. Scandinavian immigrants had been building double-wall structures for generations. The Inuit used double-layered snow houses. Russian settlers insulated with clay and straw. But in the Wind River Valley, in 1883, those techniques weren't common knowledge. Samuel had figured it out independently, tested it under crisis conditions, and proved it with numbers no one could ignore. The valley's building culture shifted, not because of preaching or persuasion, but because of results. When your neighbor burns half the wood and stays twice as warm, you stop defending the old method and start asking questions. The phrase people used wasn't Samuel's cabin. It was the warm house, and the term spread faster than the design itself. By 1887, builders across Wyoming and Montana were talking about warm houses, structures designed not just to stand, but to hold heat. The concept became a category. Anders Peterman built 2 double-wall cabins in 1886 and charged extra for the design. He gave credit to Samuel, but he also made it clear this wasn't charity or experiment. It was superior engineering, tested by the worst winter anyone could remember. The mockery disappeared. What replaced it was something quieter and more lasting: respect for the man who trusted his own thinking over crowd certainty. Samuel didn't become famous, but when people talked about building in cold country, his name came up. And when young men asked how to build a cabin that would last, old men pointed them toward a garret place and said, "Go look at that, then decide what you want." The winter of 1883 had asked a question. Samuel's cabin had answered it, and the answer spread because it was true. Samuel Garrett's cabin stood until 1924, when his grandson dismantled it to build a larger house on the same foundation. By then, the double-wall design was so common in Wyoming that no one remembered it had ever been controversial. But the story matters because it tells us something we keep forgetting. The people we call primitive weren't less intelligent than us. They were less insulated from consequences. When your survival depends on heat, you learn heat. When your children's health depends on dry wood, you learn moisture. When winter will kill you if you guess wrong, you stop guessing and start measuring. Samuel didn't have engineers or software or thermal imaging. He had cold hands, a pile of lumber, and the discipline to think clearly when everyone around him was repeating what they'd been taught. The double-wall cabin wasn't magic. It was physics. Conduction, convection, radiation. The same laws that govern every building ever made. Samuel just applied them with more precision than the standard method allowed. And that's the lesson we've lost. Somewhere along the way, we started treating traditional building methods as obsolete, slow, inefficient, outdated. We built tighter houses with better materials and cheaper energy. And we stopped asking the questions Samuel asked. Where's the heat going? How do I stop it? What's the simplest design that works? Modern construction is better in 1,000 ways, but it's also more dependent on supply chains, on fuel deliveries, on grid power. Samuel's cabin worked because it didn't depend on anything except wood, stone, and the shape of the structure itself. If the power failed, his family stayed warm. If the supply line broke, his design still functioned. That's not nostalgia. That's engineering for resilience. And resilience isn't about going backward. It's about remembering what worked under pressure and asking if we've lost something we might still need. The Wind River Valley taught Samuel Garrett that the crowd isn't always wrong, but it isn't always right either. That expertise can become habit. That tradition can become assumption. And that the best way to test an idea isn't to argue about it. It's to build it, measure it, and let the winter speak. His cabin proved what a lot of frontier designs proved. Ancient wisdom isn't ancient because it's old. It's ancient because it survived. And it survived because it worked when nothing else did. We don't need to rebuild Samuel's cabin, but we do need to rebuild his method. Observe the problem, question the standard answer, test the alternative, and trust the data over the crowd. That's not just how you build a warm house. That's how you build anything that lasts. Note, this content is educational and historical in nature. It does not replace modern building codes, professional engineering advice, or safety regulations. Always consult with licensed professionals before undertaking construction projects. So here's my question for you. Which part of Samuel's solution would you actually apply to your home today? Would you add thermal mass to your heating system? Build a double-wall shed around your firewood? Insulate your chimney better? Create an air gap layer in your walls? Drop a comment and let me know. And while you're down there, tell me where you're watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced. I want to know if you've lived through the kind of cold that makes you rethink everything you know about staying warm. If this story showed you something you didn't know, if you're thinking differently about heat, structure, or the people who build on the frontier, hit that like button. It tells me you want more of these deep dives into historical survival techniques that actually worked. And if you want one of these stories every single week, real techniques, real people, real results, subscribe right now. Because next week, I'm going to show you what Montana homesteader did with rocks, water, and gravity that kept his root cellar at 34 degrees all summer long, without a single piece of ice. These aren't myths. They're not theories. They're tested, proven methods that worked when failure meant death. And they're waiting for you to rediscover them. I'll see you in the next one.